The snow fell steadily on the quiet streets of Winter Haven, a picturesque New England town known for its dazzling Christmas traditions. Lights sparkled in every window, carolers roamed the cobblestone alleys, and the aroma of freshly baked cookies wafted from the local bakery. Despite the festive cheer surrounding him, Richard Blake felt none of it. From the window of his sleek black car, he observed the bustling streets, his expression impassive. The townspeople waved to each other with warm smiles, their laughter echoing in the crisp winter air. It was a world he had long since distanced himself from. Richard had built a fortune as a real estate mogul, and his sprawling mansion on the hill overlooking the town was a testament to his success. Yet the house, once filled with life and laughter, now stood as a silent fortress, reflecting his cold, isolated existence. Since the loss of his wife 3 years ago, Richard had poured himself into his work, leaving little time for the traditions he used to cherish. Even Christmas, once his favorite season, had become just another day. The only spark of joy left in Richard's life was his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Her wide blue eyes and constant optimism were a reminder of her mother. But Lily's health had been fragile since birth, and she required constant care. Tonight, she was asleep upstairs in her room, bundled in blankets with her favorite stuffed bunny clutched tightly in her arms. Richard had kissed her goodnight before leaving for a business meeting in the city, though the gesture had felt more perfunctory than heartfelt. As his driver navigated the snowy roads back to the mansion, Richard stared out at the empty sidewalks. It was late, and most of the town had retreated indoors. That's when he saw her. A young woman sat huddled on the steps of a closed shop, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was wearing a thin coat, clearly inadequate for the freezing temperatures, and beside her lay a scruffy dog. The animal whimpered, its ribs visible even from a distance. "Stop the car," Richard ordered abruptly. The driver hesitated but complied, pulling over to the side of the road. Richard stepped out, the biting cold immediately cutting through his tailored wool coat. He approached the woman cautiously, his polished leather shoes crunching in the snow. "Are you all right?" he asked, his deep voice tinged with hesitation. The woman looked up, her cheeks red from the cold and her lips trembling. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced away, clearly uncomfortable with his presence. "You don't look fine," Richard replied. "You'll freeze out here. Do you have somewhere to go?" She shook her head, avoiding his eyes. "I'll be okay. I'm just waiting for the storm to pass." Richard studied her for a moment. Her face, though pale and tired, was striking, with dark eyes that held a quiet determination. There was something about her that stirred a faint memory, though he couldn't place it. "You're coming with me," he said firmly. "What?" She looked up, startled. "No, I can't." "You can, and you will," he interrupted. "There's no point arguing. I won't leave you out here to freeze to death." Before she could protest further, he gestured for his driver to help. The woman reluctantly allowed herself to be led to the car, clutching her dog protectively. Inside, the warmth of the heated seats made her shiver involuntarily as her frozen limbs began to thaw. The ride to the mansion was silent, save for the soft hum of the car engine and the occasional whimper from the dog. Richard watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how she kept her gaze firmly fixed on the passing scenery, as though trying to avoid conversation. When they arrived at the mansion, she hesitated on the grand front steps, staring up at the towering facade. Richard opened the door and gestured for her to follow. "Come inside before you change your mind." The woman nodded, stepping hesitantly into the foyer. The warmth of the house enveloped her immediately, and she blinked at the sight of the grand staircase, the glittering chandelier, and the polished marble floors. "Someone will bring you a hot meal and find a room for you," Richard said briskly. "What's your name?" "Ellie," she replied softly, holding her dog close. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," Richard said curtly, already turning toward his study. "Get some rest." As he walked away, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had just made a decision that would upend his carefully ordered life. He brushed it aside, convincing himself that it was nothing more than an act of charity. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if it might be something more. Ellie sat silently in the small guest room she had been led to, the crackling fireplace providing a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Her dog, Max, curled up at her feet, already asleep. The soft blankets and gentle hum of the house were a stark contrast to the biting cold she had endured just hours before. She ran her fingers through Max's fur, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Who was this man who had taken her in? Why had he done it? And what did he expect in return? Downstairs, Richard sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He stared into the flames dancing in the fireplace, the events of the evening playing over in his mind. He had no reason to involve himself in Ellie's life, yet something about her had compelled him to act. Her vulnerability, her defiance in the face of her circumstances. It struck a chord he didn't fully understand. He took a long sip of his drink, telling himself he had done his part. In the morning, she would move on, and life would return to its usual, predictable rhythm. Morning came softly, the light from the snow-covered grounds illuminating the house. Richard had barely slept, his mind restless. As he descended the grand staircase, he was greeted by a sound he hadn't heard in a long time: laughter. It was light and musical, and it tugged at something deep within him. He followed it to the sunroom, where Lily sat cross-legged on the floor with Ellie. Between them was a pile of paper, scissors, and glitter. "You're awake," Lily exclaimed, her pale cheeks flushed with excitement. "Ellie's helping me make decorations for the tree. She said when she was little, her family always made their own." Richard blinked at the scene, momentarily caught off guard. Ellie looked up, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Lily was telling me you don't have a tree yet. I thought, maybe this could help." He frowned slightly, his gaze flicking between the two. Lily hadn't smiled like this in weeks, let alone shown this much energy. He cleared his throat. "We usually have one brought in and decorated professionally." "Well, we thought we'd make our own ornaments this year," Ellie said, her tone light but her eyes searching his face, gauging his reaction. Lily grinned up at him. "Isn't it fun, Daddy? Look, Ellie made this one. It's a snowman." Richard's frown softened as he knelt to examine the glitter-covered creation. "It's creative," he said, his voice tinged with an unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel so cold. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the trio continued their impromptu crafting session. Ellie shared stories about her childhood, carefully chosen, with details that painted a picture of simpler, happier times. Lily listened intently, her laughter ringing out with every funny anecdote. Richard found himself watching Ellie more closely, noting the way her eyes lit up as she spoke, the quiet strength in her voice. There was a resilience to her that he couldn't ignore. But as the day wore on, questions began to creep into his mind. Who was Ellie, really? What was she doing in Winter Haven, homeless and alone? And why did she seem so familiar? Later that evening, as the house grew quiet and Lily retreated to her room, Richard sought out Ellie. He found her in the library, Max asleep at her feet once again. She was staring at the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of old books. "You seem at home here," Richard said, his voice cutting through the silence. Ellie turned, her expression unreadable. "It's a beautiful house." "It is. But not everyone belongs here." His words hung in the air, heavier than he intended. He softened his tone. "I just mean, you've made Lily very happy today. I haven't seen her like this in a long time." Ellie nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "She's a special little girl. You're lucky to have her." "I am," he admitted. "But luck doesn't explain you. You haven't told me much about yourself, Ellie." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of the bookshelf. "There's not much to tell." "I find that hard to believe," Richard said, stepping closer. "You know how to charm a child who barely speaks to anyone. You sit here, perfectly at ease in a stranger's home. You speak like someone who's used to more than the streets. So why were you out there?" Ellie's jaw tightened, and she turned away. People don't always end up where they thought they'd be. Sometimes life takes things away, and you're left with nothing. Richard studied her, his curiosity deepening. There was pain in her voice, but also a defensiveness that hinted at more. "If you want to stay, I need to know the truth." Ellie's eyes met his, a storm brewing within them. "Why? So you can decide if I'm worth your pity?" "It's not pity," Richard replied sharply. "It's responsibility. I have a daughter to protect." Her expression softened slightly, but the walls around her didn't fall. "I don't want to cause trouble, Mr. Blake. If you want me gone, just say the word," Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want you gone, but I need to understand who you are." Ellie's gaze dropped to Max, who stirred slightly at her feet. "It's complicated," she said finally, "and I don't think you're ready for the answers." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. He realized he wasn't sure if he was ready. Ellie was an enigma, and whatever secret she held, they felt like they were on the verge of changing everything. For now, he let it go. But the questions lingered, unanswered and heavy, as the snow continued to fall outside. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard could have anticipated. Ellie's presence in the house was quiet but undeniable. She kept to herself most of the time, helping around the kitchen or playing with Lily, who had grown visibly more spirited. For the first time in months, Lily's laughter echoed through the halls, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she and Ellie worked together to make more decorations or baked cookies in the kitchen. Richard found himself drawn to these moments, lingering in doorways or pausing on the stairs to watch them. Ellie had an ease about her that he couldn't quite understand. Despite the clear hardships she'd endured, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that felt at odds with her situation. She treated everyone in the house, from the staff to Lily, with kindness and respect, but there was always a hint of guardedness in her eyes. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Ellie was holding something back. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Richard decided he'd had enough of the mystery. He found Ellie sitting in the small library again, her usual retreat when the house grew still. Max was at her feet as always, and she was engrossed in a book, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. "Am I interrupting?" Richard asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ellie looked up, her expression unreadable. "Not at all," she said, closing the book and setting it aside. Richard stepped inside, his hands in his pockets. "You've been here for a few days now. Lily seems happier than I've seen her in a long time." "She's a remarkable girl," Ellie replied with a small smile. "She has so much strength for someone so young." "She does," Richard agreed, sitting down in the armchair opposite her. "And I think she sees the same strength in you." Ellie's smile faltered slightly, and she looked away. "I'm not sure that's true." "I am," Richard said firmly. "You've made a difference in her life, Ellie, and I'm grateful for that. But I can't ignore the fact that I still don't know much about you." Ellie sighed, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking Max's fur. "You've been kind to me, Mr. Blake. More than kind. But my story isn't something people want to hear." "Try me," Richard said, his tone gentle but insistent. Ellie hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fire. For a moment, Richard thought she might refuse, but then she began to speak. "I grew up in a small town not far from here," she said, her voice quiet. "My mother worked as a maid, and we didn't have much, but we got by. She always told me to dream big, to work hard and make a better life for myself. And for a while I did. I went to college, got a job as a nurse, and thought I was building the future she wanted for me." Richard leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of what was coming next. "What happened?" Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Life happened. My mother got sick, and I had to leave my job to take care of her. The bills piled up, and when she passed, I was left with nothing. I tried to start over, but it's not that simple. One setback after another, and eventually, you find yourself with nowhere to go." There was a rawness in her voice that made Richard's chest tighten. He hadn't expected her to open up so much, and yet he could tell she was still holding something back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." Ellie shrugged, though there was no real nonchalance in the gesture. "It is what it is. You learn to survive. And sometimes, you find kindness in unexpected places." Richard studied her for a long moment. "Why Winter Haven? Why come here?" Ellie hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of the chair. "I used to hear stories about this town when I was younger," she said, her voice carefully measured. "It always sounded like a place where people found hope. I guess I thought, maybe I could find some too." There was something in her tone that gave Richard pause, a weight to her words that hinted at a deeper meaning. He wanted to press her further, to ask what she wasn't saying, but he held back. She had given him more than he'd expected, and he didn't want to push too hard. "I hope you do," he said finally. "Find hope, I mean." Ellie looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his. For the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability there, a crack in the armor she wore so carefully. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The moment lingered between them, the silence filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. Then, as if sensing the intensity of the moment, Max stirred and let out a small yawn, breaking the spell. Ellie smiled faintly and leaned down to scratch behind his ears. Richard stood, feeling the need to retreat before the conversation became too personal. "Good night, Ellie," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Good night, Mr. Blake," she replied. As he left the library, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Ellie was more connected to this town, and perhaps even to him, than she was letting on. The mystery of her presence lingered in his mind, and he resolved to find out the truth, no matter where it led. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the grand foyer. Richard stood by the kitchen island, sipping his coffee, while his mind replayed the conversation with Ellie from the night before. Her story lingered in his thoughts, stirring emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Her resilience, her quiet strength. It was impossible to ignore. Yet there was something unspoken in her words, a piece of the puzzle still missing. He was determined to find it. The sound of laughter pulled him from his thoughts. Peering into the living room, he saw Lily and Ellie seated on the floor, surrounded by an explosion of paper snowflakes. Lily was holding up one of her creations, her face glowing with pride. "Daddy, look," she called, waving the snowflake. "Ellie taught me how to make this one. Isn't it pretty?" Richard walked over, smiling despite himself. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. You've become quite the artist." Lily beamed. "Ellie said we could hang them in the windows so it looks like it's snowing inside too." "That's a great idea," Richard said, glancing at Ellie. She was folding another sheet of paper, her movements precise and calm. There was an ease about her when she was with Lily, as if they'd known each other far longer than a few days. Ellie looked up and caught his gaze. "You're welcome to join us, Mr. Blake. We could use an extra pair of hands." Richard hesitated, unaccustomed to the casual warmth in her tone. But Lily's hopeful expression broke through his reluctance. He sat down, feeling slightly out of place amid the crafting chaos. "I don't think I've made one of these since grade school," he admitted, picking up a pair of scissors. Ellie laughed softly. "It's like riding a bike. You don't forget." Under Ellie's guidance, Richard fumbled through folding and cutting, producing a snowflake that was slightly lopsided but passable. Lily clapped enthusiastically, declaring it the best one yet. For a moment, the room felt alive with a joy Richard hadn't experienced in years. He couldn't help but notice how naturally Ellie fit into the scene, as though she belonged. As the morning wore on, the three of them worked together to hang the snowflakes in the windows. By the time they finished, the house felt transformed. Sunlight streamed through the delicate paper creations, casting intricate patterns on the walls and floors. Lily twirled beneath them, her laughter filling the room. "Perfect," Ellie said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. Richard glanced at her. "You've brought a lot of life back into this house, Ellie." She looked at him, her smile softening. "Sometimes it just takes a little imagination." Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of the housekeeper, Mrs. Hensley, who carried a tray of hot cocoa. "I thought you might need something warm after all that hard work," she said with a smile. Lily grabbed a mug eagerly, settling onto the couch with Max curled up beside her. Richard and Ellie followed suit, and the three of them sipped their cocoa in comfortable silence. As the day stretched into afternoon, Richard excused himself to make a few calls, leaving Ellie and Lily alone. The two continued their crafting, Ellie occasionally glancing toward the doorway, as if expecting Richard to return. She felt a strange mix of comfort and unease in his presence, as though he could see past the walls she had carefully built around herself. Later, as twilight descended, Richard returned to the living room, his expression thoughtful. He had spent part of the afternoon making inquiries about Ellie's background. What little he had learned left him with more questions than answers. Her story about her mother and her struggles appeared to be true, but there was a detail he couldn't overlook. Ellie had mentioned growing up in a nearby town, yet no one there seemed to know her, or at least, no one was willing to talk about her. Richard decided to approach the subject cautiously. After dinner, while Lily was upstairs playing, he found Ellie sitting by the fire with Max. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded but curious. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from her. Ellie nodded. "Of course." Richard sat down, studying her for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you told me the other night. About why you came to Winter Haven." Ellie's posture stiffened slightly, though her expression remained neutral. "And I can't help but feel there's more to the story," he said carefully. "Something you're not telling me." Ellie's gaze dropped to her hands, which rested in her lap. "Why does it matter?" she asked quietly. "I'm here now. Isn't that enough?" "It might be," Richard said. "But if there's something I need to know, something that could affect Lily, I think I have the right to ask." Ellie flinched at the mention of Lily, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sweater. "I would never do anything to hurt her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe you," Richard said gently. "But trust goes both ways, Ellie. If we're going to keep moving forward, I need to understand who you are." Ellie was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on the fire. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with hesitation. "I came to Winter Haven because I thought I might find answers here. About my family." Richard's brow furrowed. "Your family?" Ellie nodded, her expression pained. "My mother told me once, before she passed, that my father was from here. She didn't tell me much, just that he left before I was born. I didn't come here looking for him, exactly, but I thought maybe I'd find some trace of him. Something to help me understand who he was." Richard leaned back, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "You think he might still be here?" Ellie shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe he's long gone. Or maybe he doesn't want to be found. Either way, I didn't expect." She trailed off, her eyes meeting his for a brief, intense moment. "I didn't expect this." Richard's chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but he could see the strain on her face. For now, he let the subject rest, though his mind raced with possibilities. The truth, he suspected, was closer than either of them realized. The following morning, Winter Haven awoke under a blanket of fresh snow. The town streets, already dressed in holiday charm, seemed even more magical in the soft morning light. Richard sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee while reviewing a few documents. His focus, however, kept wandering. Ellie's revelation the previous evening had left him with more questions than answers. Her father, a man she had never known, had roots in this town, and while she hadn't come searching for him specifically, it was clear her presence in Winter Haven wasn't accidental. Ellie appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back and her expression calm, though there was a subtle weariness in her eyes. "Good morning," she said softly, offering a faint smile. "Morning," Richard replied, setting his papers aside. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," Ellie answered, moving to pour herself a cup of tea. Max padded in after her, his tail wagging as he settled near her feet. Richard hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the chair across from him. "Do you have a moment? There's something I'd like to talk about." Ellie paused, her hand resting on the back of the chair. "Of course," she said after a beat, taking a seat and folding her hands in her lap. Richard leaned forward slightly, his tone measured. "I've been thinking about what you told me last night. About your father. I want to help you." Ellie blinked, clearly taken aback. "Help me?" "Yes," Richard said. "If your father was from Winter Haven, there's a good chance someone in town might know something about him. It's a small place. People here have long memories." Ellie looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of her mug. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure it's a good idea. I didn't come here to stir up old stories or dig into anyone's past. Richard studied her, sensing the reluctance in her voice. Ellie, you deserve answers. Whatever you find, it's your right to know. She sighed, her gaze distant. It's not that simple. What if he doesn't want to be found? What if I'm just a part of his life he wants to forget? Then that's on him, Richard said firmly. But you'll never know unless you try. Ellie didn't respond immediately. She stared into her tea, her thoughts clearly racing. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. All right, I'll think about it. Richard decided not to press further. He could see how difficult the idea was for her, and he didn't want to push too hard. But he made a mental note to do some quiet investigating of his own. If there were answers to be found, he was determined to find them. Later that day, while Ellie and Lily worked on another batch of homemade ornaments, Richard made a trip into town. Winter Haven's main street was bustling with activity, the storefronts decked out in festive decorations and wreaths. He stopped at the local diner, a hub for town gossip and history. As he stepped inside, the warmth and chatter enveloped him. Richard Blake, an older man behind the counter, greeted with a wide smile. Haven't seen you in here in ages. What brings you down from the mansion? Morning, Sam, Richard said, returning the smile. I was hoping you might help me with something. Sam raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Depends on what it is. Richard took a seat at the counter, lowering his voice slightly. I'm trying to track down some information about someone who might have lived here years ago. A man, mid-40s to 50s now, connected to a woman named Harper. Ring any bells? Sam rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his expression growing serious. Harper, you say? Can't say I recall anyone by that name, but if it was years back, maybe someone else might know. Richard nodded. If you hear anything, let me know. I'll keep an ear out, Sam promised, pouring Richard a cup of coffee. What's this about, anyway? You don't usually go poking around people's histories. It's personal, Richard said simply, leaving it at that. As he left the diner, his thoughts churned. The name Harper hadn't sparked any recognition, but Richard wasn't ready to give up. He made his way to the town archives, housed in the library, and spent hours combing through old records. He found a few mentions of a woman with the last name Harper, a maid who had worked in Winter Haven decades ago. The details were sparse, but it was enough to confirm a connection. When Richard returned home that evening, Ellie was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Hensley prepare dinner. She looked up as he entered, her expression cautious. Busy day? She asked, her tone light. Something like that, Richard replied. He didn't mention his trip into town, deciding to wait until he had more concrete information. Instead, he shifted the conversation. How's Lily? Full of energy, Ellie said with a small laugh. She's been running circles around Max all afternoon. Richard smiled at the thought, but his mind remained preoccupied. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something significant, something that could change everything. As the evening wore on, the house settled into its usual calm. Lily was tucked into bed, and the staff had retired for the night. Richard found himself in his study, staring at the notes he had made earlier. The pieces were starting to come together, but one question loomed larger than all the rest. What would Ellie do when she learned the truth? He closed the notebook with a sigh, his gaze drifting to the snow falling softly outside. The night was quiet, save for the faint sound of the clock ticking in the corner. Somewhere in this town lay the answers Ellie had been searching for. And whether she was ready or not, Richard was determined to help her find them. The following morning, Ellie woke early. The house was still quiet, save for the faint creak of the wooden floors as she made her way to the kitchen. She had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the mansion, the early stirrings of the housekeeper, the distant hum of Richard's morning phone calls, and Lily's soft footsteps when she finally woke and ventured downstairs. This morning, however, Ellie felt restless. She brewed a cup of tea and sat by the kitchen window, gazing out at the snowy landscape. The peacefulness of Winter Haven was both comforting and unnerving, as if the stillness concealed something just out of reach. Richard appeared in the doorway, his presence breaking her reverie. He was dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, his usual polished demeanor slightly more relaxed. "Good morning," he said, his voice low. so as not to disturb the silence. "Morning," Ellie replied, wrapping her hands around her mug. "You're up early." "Old habit," Richard said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He joined her at the table, his gaze flicking to the window. "It's a beautiful morning." Ellie nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Richard noticed her distant expression and set his coffee down. "Something on your mind?" She hesitated before answering. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About finding answers." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And I'm not sure what I'll find," Ellie admitted, "or if it'll be worth the risk. But I think I need to try." Richard nodded slowly. "I think you're right." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "I did some digging yesterday. I found a record of a woman named Harper who worked here in Winter Haven. She was a maid, years ago. I think it might have been your mother." Ellie's breath caught, her eyes widening. "You found something?" "It's not much," Richard said cautiously, "but it's a start. I thought we could go into town together today, see if anyone remembers her." Ellie looked at him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "You do that?" Richard met her gaze. "Of course. You deserve to know the truth." After breakfast, the two of them bundled up and set out for town. Lily stayed behind, happily occupied with Mrs. Hensley, who promised to teach her how to bake gingerbread cookies. As they drove through the snow-dusted streets, Ellie couldn't shake the nervous energy building inside her. The prospect of uncovering pieces of her past, pieces she had long believed lost, was both thrilling and terrifying. Their first stop was the diner, where Richard introduced Ellie to Sam. The older man gave her a warm smile, though he admitted he didn't recognize the name Harper. "It's been a long time," he said, "but there's someone who might know more." Sam directed them to a small house on the outskirts of town, where an elderly woman named Ruth lived. Ruth had been a fixture in Winter Haven for decades and was known for her encyclopedic memory of the town's history. When they arrived, Ruth greeted them with a sharp wit that belied her years. "You're the Blake boy, aren't you?" she said, squinting up at Richard. "You've grown into quite the man." Richard smiled politely. "It's nice to see you again, Mrs. Bell. I was hoping you might be able to help my friend Ellie here." Ruth's keen eyes shifted to Ellie. "And who might you be, dear?" Ellie introduced herself, explaining her connection to the Harper name. Ruth listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When Ellie finished, Ruth leaned back in her chair, tapping her chin. "Harper," she repeated. "I remember a young woman by that name. She worked as a maid for one of the families here. Kind girl, always polite. I think she had a daughter." Ellie's heart raced. "Do you remember anything about her?" Ruth nodded slowly. "She didn't stay in town long. Left suddenly, if I recall. There was talk about her having a child out of wedlock. In those days, people could be cruel about things like that." Richard frowned. "Do you know who the father was?" Ruth hesitated, her gaze darting between them. "I can't say for certain, but there were rumors. People said he was someone from one of the prominent families. Someone with a lot to lose." Ellie felt her stomach drop. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but they painted a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see. "Do you remember his name?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ruth shook her head. "I'm sorry, dear. I never knew for sure. But if you're looking for answers, there's one place you might check. The town archives have old records, employment rosters, birth certificates. It's not much, but it's a start." Ellie thanked Ruth, though her mind was already racing ahead. As they drove to the archives, Richard glanced at her, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," Ellie admitted. "It's a lot to take in." Richard reached over, resting a hand briefly on hers. "Whatever we find, you're not alone in this." The archives were housed in a modest brick building near the center of town. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. A librarian directed them to the section containing employment records from decades past. Together, they combed through the fragile pages, searching for any mention of Harper. After what felt like hours, Ellie froze, her finger hovering over a line of text. "Here," she whispered. "Margaret Harper, employed as a maid at the Ashcroft estate." Richard leaned over, reading the entry. The Ashcrofts, he murmured. They were one of the wealthiest families in town back then. Ellie's hands trembled as she turned the pages, scanning for more information. What she found next made her heart stop. A note, scrawled in the margin of an old roster. Left abruptly, scandal involving Mr. Ashcroft. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide with shock. Do you think? It's possible, Richard said carefully, but we need more than this. Ellie nodded, though the weight of the discovery pressed heavily on her chest. As they left the archives, the snow began to fall again, the gentle flakes swirling around them. Ellie felt a storm brewing inside her, a mix of anger, sadness, and hope. For so long, she had wondered about the man who had shaped her life from the shadows, the man her mother had never spoken of except in hushed tones. Now, standing on the brink of the truth, she wasn't sure she wanted to know more. But as Richard guided her back to the car, his steady presence grounding her, Ellie realized she didn't have to face it alone. Whatever answers lay ahead, she was ready to face them. And she knew, deep down, that this journey was leading her to something greater than she had ever imagined. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy in the air. Ellie stared out the window, watching the snow-covered town blur into a soft haze as they climbed the hill toward the estate. Her mind churned with questions, memories, and emotions she had long buried. Margaret Harper, her mother, had worked for the Ashcrofts, one of the wealthiest families in Winter Haven, and left under a cloud of scandal. Ellie's mother had always been strong, resilient, and fiercely protective, but she had rarely spoken of the past. Now Ellie understood why. Richard glanced at her from the driver's seat, his brow furrowed with concern. "You've been quiet. I'm just trying to process everything," Ellie said softly. "It's strange. I grew up not knowing anything about my father, and now it feels like the answers are right there, just out of reach." "We'll figure it out," Richard said firmly. "You've come this far. You deserve to know the truth." Ellie nodded, but doubt lingered in her heart. Part of her wasn't sure she wanted to uncover what lay ahead. What if her father had rejected her mother? What if he had known about Ellie and chosen to ignore her existence? Those possibilities were too painful to dwell on, yet they loomed like shadows in her mind. When they arrived at the mansion, Lily ran to greet them, her face lighting up with excitement. "You're back. Look what we made." She held up a tray of slightly misshapen gingerbread cookies, each one decorated with colorful icing and sprinkles. Ellie forced a smile, her heart softening at Lily's enthusiasm. "They look delicious. They're for the Christmas party tomorrow," Lily announced. "Mrs. Hensley said we could make a big plate for everyone." Richard crouched down to inspect the cookies, his tone teasing. "Are you sure these aren't too pretty to eat?" Lily giggled. "You have to try one." As Lily skipped off to the kitchen to retrieve more cookies, Ellie followed her, grateful for the distraction. She spent the rest of the evening helping Lily and Mrs. Hensley prepare for the holiday party. The mansion was transformed into a winter wonderland, with garlands draped along the banisters, candles flickering in every window, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filling the air. For a few hours, Ellie allowed herself to forget the weight of her discoveries and focus on the warmth and joy of the season. But later that night, as the house grew quiet, Ellie found herself unable to sleep. She paced her room, her thoughts racing. The mention of the Ashcrofts had stirred something deep within her, a faint memory, long buried but not forgotten. She remembered her mother humming a lullaby, her voice trembling with emotion. She remembered the name Ashcroft spoken in whispers, followed by hurried changes of subject. Driven by a need for answers, Ellie slipped out of her room and made her way to the library. She searched through the shelves, pulling down old books and records, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on her mother's connection to the Ashcrofts. Hours passed as she pored over dusty volumes, her frustration mounting. "Ellie," she jumped, turning to find Richard standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a simple sweater and slacks, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What are you doing up?" "I couldn't sleep," Ellie admitted, gesturing to the mess of books on the table. "I thought maybe there'd be something here. Some clue." Richard stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the scattered papers. "You've been busy." "I'm sorry," Ellie said, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't mean to make a mess." "It's fine," Richard said gently. He sat down across from her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Did you find anything?" Ellie shook her head. "Nothing useful. Just old family histories and business records." The Ashcrofts they were everywhere in this town. They owned property, businesses, everything. But there's nothing personal here. Nothing about my mother. Richard reached for one of the books, flipping through its pages. The Ashcrofts were powerful. It's possible they buried anything that might have caused a scandal. Ellie sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Maybe I'm wasting my time. Maybe I should just let it go." "You don't believe that," Richard said quietly. "If you did, you wouldn't be here right now." Ellie looked at him, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. I don't know if I'm ready for what I might find. What if my father knew about me and didn't care? What if my mother gave up everything for someone who never wanted her?" Richard's expression softened, his voice steady. "Then that's on him, not you. None of this is your fault, Ellie. You've spent your whole life wondering about the truth. You deserve to know it, no matter what it is." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, but she blinked them away, nodding. "You're right. I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to do it alone," Richard said firmly. "We'll figure it out together." The quiet conviction in his voice steadied her, and for the first time, Ellie felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this. Richard's unwavering support gave her the strength to keep searching, to face whatever truths lay ahead. The next morning, as the sun rose over Winterhaven, the house buzzed with activity. Guests began arriving for the Christmas party, filling the mansion with laughter and cheer. Ellie moved through the crowd, her mind still preoccupied with the unanswered questions surrounding her past. She exchanged polite smiles and greetings, but her heart wasn't in it. It wasn't until she saw Ruth Bell entering the room, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd, that Ellie felt a jolt of purpose. She made her way over to the older woman, who greeted her with a knowing smile. "Ellie," Ruth said, her tone warm. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm glad you came," Ellie said, her voice steady. "I was hoping we could talk more." "About my mother." Ruth's expression grew serious, and she nodded. "Of course, dear. Let's find somewhere quiet." The two of them slipped away from the crowd, settling in a small sitting room near the back of the house. As they spoke, Ruth revealed more details about the Ashcrofts and their influence over the town. She described the patriarch, Edward Ashcroft, as a man of great charm but questionable morals. He had been known for his affairs, though none were ever made public. Ellie's stomach churned as she listened, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Her mother's departure from Winterhaven, the whispers of scandal, the man who had never claimed her as his own. It all pointed to Edward Ashcroft. "Do you think he knew about me?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth hesitated, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I can't say for certain, but knowing Edward, I wouldn't be surprised if he did." Ellie sat back, her mind reeling. The truth was both devastating and clarifying. She had spent her life wondering about her father, hoping for answers. Now she had them, and they were more painful than she could have imagined. But as she sat there, the warmth of the house surrounding her, Ellie realized something else. She had found something far more valuable than the truth about her father. She had found a family in Lily and Richard, a place where she belonged. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to move forward. Ellie spent the remainder of the party in a daze, the revelations from her conversation with Ruth swirling in her mind. The truth she had sought for so long had finally emerged, but it was far from the resolution she had hoped for. Edward Ashcroft, her likely father, had been a man of power and influence who had seemingly turned his back on her mother, and by extension, on her. The knowledge left her feeling hollow, yet strangely unburdened. At least now she knew. Richard found her standing near the large bay windows overlooking the snow-covered garden. The party was still in full swing behind them, the sounds of laughter and conversation filling the air. He approached her quietly, his presence grounding. "Ellie," he said softly, "are you all right?" She turned to face him, her expression weary but composed. "I spoke to Ruth," she began. "She confirmed what I suspected. Edward Ashcroft. He's my father." Richard's jaw tightened, and he nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm sorry. I know that's not easy to hear." "It's not," Ellie admitted, "but it's also clarifying. All my life, I've wondered who he was, why he wasn't there. And now I know. He wasn't the kind of man who took responsibility. My mother deserved better." Richard reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She did, and so do you." Ellie smiled faintly, her gratitude for his support shining through the sadness in her eyes. "Thank you for helping me, for caring." "You don't have to thank me," Richard said, his voice warm. "You've become a part of this family, Ellie. Lily adores you, and so do I." Ellie's breath hitched at his words, her heart swelling with an unexpected mix of emotions. She searched his eyes, seeing only sincerity there. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly valued. Not for what she could do or provide, but for who she was. "Richard," she began, her voice faltering. But before she could say more, Lily ran up to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Daddy!" "Ellie!" Lily exclaimed, tugging on their hands. "Come see." Mrs. Hensley lit the tree in the garden, and it's so beautiful. Ellie and Richard exchanged a look, the moment between them unspoken but understood. He smiled and gestured toward the door. "Let's go see the tree." The three of them stepped out into the crisp night air, the party's glow fading behind them. In the garden, a towering pine tree stood illuminated by hundreds of twinkling lights, its branches adorned with handmade ornaments from earlier in the week. Lily clapped her hands in delight, her laughter ringing out as she twirled in the snow. "It's magical," Ellie said, her voice soft with wonder. "It is," Richard agreed, though his gaze was fixed on her rather than the tree. They stood together, watching Lily dance beneath the tree's glow. For a moment, the heaviness of the day lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Ellie felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging she had never dared to hope for. As the evening wore on, the party began to wind down. Guests bid their farewells, their laughter lingering in the halls as they departed. Ellie helped Mrs. Hensley tidy up, her mind still spinning with the events of the day. When the house finally grew quiet, she retreated to her room, hoping for a few moments of solitude. But as she sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds, there was a soft knock at her door. She turned to see Richard standing there, his expression hesitant but kind. "Can I come in?" he asked. Ellie nodded, gesturing to the chair near the window. Richard stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. He sat down, his gaze thoughtful. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "I know today was a lot." Ellie smiled faintly. "It was. But I think I needed it. As hard as it was to hear, it's better than not knowing." Richard nodded, his expression serious. "You've been through so much, Ellie. More than anyone should have to. And yet, here you are, strong, kind, and somehow still finding ways to bring joy to everyone around you." Ellie looked away, her cheeks flushing at his words. "I don't know about that." "I do," Richard said firmly. "You've brought something to this house that I didn't realize we were missing. Lily, she's happier than I've seen her in years. And me," he hesitated, his voice softening. "You've reminded me of what it means to care, to feel connected to someone again." Ellie's heart raced at his words, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Richard, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "I just wanted you to know how much you mean to us. To me." Ellie met his gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You mean a lot to me too. More than I ever expected." They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken connection between them filling the room. Finally, Richard stood, his movements deliberate. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow's Christmas, and I have a feeling it's going to be a special one." Ellie nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Richard." "Good night, Ellie." As he left the room, Ellie felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. Despite the pain of her past, she realized she had found something far greater than the answers she had sought. She had found a family, a place where she was loved and valued. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. That night, as the snow continued to fall outside, Ellie drifted off to sleep with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The past no longer held the power to define her. What mattered now was the present, and the people who had shown her the true meaning of love and belonging. The morning of Christmas dawned crisp and bright, the snow outside sparkling under the sunlight. The mansion hummed with a gentle energy, its halls filled with the scents of pine and cinnamon, mingling with the warm aroma of breakfast being prepared in the kitchen. Ellie woke to the sound of Lily's excited chatter in the hallway, her footsteps quick and light as she bounded toward Richard's room. A smile tugged at Ellie's lips. She hadn't experienced a Christmas morning like this in years, if ever. She dressed quickly, pulling on a soft sweater that Mrs. Hensley had loaned her, and made her way downstairs. The living room was a sight to behold. The Christmas tree stood tall and majestic, its branches laden with ornaments both handmade and glittering with store-bought perfection. Piles of wrapped gifts lay beneath it, their shiny paper catching the morning light. It was as though the entire house had come alive with the spirit of the holiday. Lily was already near the tree, bouncing on her toes as Richard appeared, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. He looked more relaxed than Ellie had ever seen him, his usual businesslike demeanor softened by the warmth of the day. His eyes met hers as she entered the room, and he smiled. "Merry Christmas, Ellie," he said. "Merry Christmas," she replied, her voice touched with the same warmth. "Ellie, come sit by me," Lily called, waving her over to the couch. Ellie obliged, taking a seat as Lily began distributing gifts, her excitement contagious. The morning unfolded with laughter and joy as Lily opened each present, her face lighting up with every reveal. Richard watched her fondly, his own happiness evident in the way his eyes crinkled with each of her delighted exclamations. Ellie hadn't expected to find herself included in the festivities, but to her surprise, there were gifts for her too. Lily handed her a box wrapped in gold paper, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "This one's for you, Ellie," she said. "Daddy picked it out." Ellie glanced at Richard, who shrugged with a modest smile. She carefully unwrapped the box, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a small snowflake pendant. It was simple yet elegant, and it caught the light beautifully. "It's lovely," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. You've brought a lot of magic into this house," Richard said softly. It felt right. Ellie fastened the necklace around her neck, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, unimportant. But here, in this house, with these people, she felt seen in a way she never had before. As the morning turned to afternoon, the warmth of the day only grew. Mrs. Hensley prepared a feast in the kitchen, the smell of roasted turkey and spiced apple pie wafting through the house. Guests began to arrive for the Christmas dinner, friends of the family, neighbors from town, and a few members of Richard's business circle. Ellie found herself swept up in the festivities, her nervousness fading as she was welcomed into the fold with open arms. Lily flitted between the guests like a tiny hostess, showing off the decorations she and Ellie had made. At one point, she dragged Ellie to the grand piano in the corner of the living room, her eyes shining with mischief. "Play something," Lily urged. "Please." Ellie hesitated, glancing at the crowd. "Oh, I don't know. It's been years." "Please," Lily begged, her hands clasped in front of her. Richard appeared beside them, his expression encouraging. "I'd like to hear you play too," he said. With a mixture of reluctance and amusement, Ellie took a seat at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to play a soft, familiar melody, a Christmas carol her mother used to hum. The notes filled the room, weaving through the conversations and drawing everyone's attention. Ellie played with a quiet grace, her nerves dissipating as the music carried her. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Ellie looked up, her cheeks flushed, to find Richard watching her with a mixture of pride and admiration. "You're full of surprises," he said as the applause died down. "I guess I am," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. As the evening wore on, The guests began to drift away, their laughter and well wishes lingering in the air. The house grew quieter, the festive energy giving way to a more intimate warmth. Ellie found herself in the living room with Richard and Lily, the three of them seated near the fireplace as the last embers glowed softly. Lily, her energy finally waning, rested her head on Ellie's lap, her eyes heavy with sleep. "This was the best Christmas ever," she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion. Ellie stroked her hair, her heart full. "I think so too." Richard watched them from his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said after a long pause. Ellie looked up, confused. "For what?" "For being here," he said simply. "For everything you've done for Lily. For this house. For me." Ellie's throat tightened at his words, and she blinked back, the tears threatening to spill. "You don't have to thank me. Being here has been more than I ever could have hoped for." Richard leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, uncovering everything about your past, but I hope you know you're not alone in this. You have us now. You have a family." The weight of his words settled over her, filling the space inside her that had long been empty. For so many years, she had carried the burden of her past alone, believing that love and belonging were out of reach. But here, in this house with these people, she had found something she hadn't dared to dream of, a home. Lily stirred in her lap, her small hand reaching out to grasp Ellie's. Ellie held it tightly, her heart overflowing. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. And as the snow continued to fall softly outside, blanketing the world in a quiet peace, Ellie realized that this Christmas had brought her more than she ever thought possible. It had given her hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. The morning after Christmas arrived with a serene calm. The snow outside had settled into a pristine blanket, and the sunlight streaming through the windows gave the house an ethereal glow. Ellie woke early, slipping out of her room with Max padding silently beside her. The house was still, save for the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth downstairs. She wandered into the living room, pausing by the Christmas tree that still stood proudly, its lights twinkling faintly in the dim morning light. She touched one of the handmade ornaments, a paper snowflake she and Lily had crafted together. The memories of the past days swirled in her mind. Lily's laughter, Richard's quiet smiles, the overwhelming sense of belonging that had taken root in her heart. For so long, she had been searching for something she couldn't name, a sense of completeness that always seemed just out of reach. Now, in this house with these people, she realized she had found it. "Up early again?" Richard's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway. He was dressed casually, his hair slightly tousled, a mug of coffee in his hand. The sight of him was both comforting and grounding, a reminder of how much her life had changed in such a short time. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's too quiet," Richard chuckled softly, stepping into the room and offering her a second mug he had been carrying. "Here, I figured you might need this." She accepted it gratefully, the warmth of the coffee seeping into her hands. "Thanks." They sat together on the couch, the silence between them companionable. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the space. Finally, Richard broke the quiet. "You've been thinking about yesterday," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Ellie nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "It's a lot to process. Knowing who my father was. It answers some questions, but it raises so many more." Richard's gaze was steady, filled with empathy. "You don't have to figure it all out at once. Sometimes answers take time." Ellie looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I think what scares me the most is what it all means. Knowing he was someone who didn't care about me, or my mother. It makes me wonder if I was ever meant to find a place where I belonged." "You belong here," Richard said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "You belong with us." The conviction in his tone brought tears to Ellie's eyes, but she blinked them away, a soft smile breaking through. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." They sat in silence again, the moment heavy with unspoken emotions. Ellie felt a warmth growing in her chest, not just from the coffee or the fire, but from the undeniable bond she shared with Richard. It was something she hadn't expected, something she hadn't dared to hope for. Yet it was there, tangible and real. "Ellie," Richard began, his voice quieter now. "I've been thinking a lot too. About you, about Lily, about everything that's happened since you came into our lives. And I've realized something." Her heart quickened, her gaze locking with his. "What is it?" "You've changed everything," he said simply. "You've brought life back into this house, laughter back into Lily's days. And for me, you've reminded me of what it means to feel again, to care, to hope." Ellie's breath caught, her eyes glistening. "Richard, He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. But I want you to know that you matter to me, more than I ever expected." Ellie's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You matter to me too," she said softly, her voice trembling with sincerity. "You and Lily, you've given me something I thought I'd never find. A home, a family." Richard's hand tightened around hers, his gaze steady and filled with emotion. "Then stay. Stay with us, Ellie. Not just for a few days or weeks. Stay for good." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ellie felt her heart swell, her mind racing with possibilities. She thought of Lily's laughter, of Richard's quiet strength, of the warmth and love she had found in this house. And for the first time in her life, the answer was clear. "I want to stay," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "I want to be here, with you, with Lily." A smile broke across Richard's face, genuine and full of relief. "You have no idea how much that means to me." "To us." Ellie smiled back, her heart full. "I think I do." At that moment, the sound of footsteps broke the quiet. Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, Max trailing behind her. She rubbed her eyes and looked at them with a sleepy smile. "Good morning," she said, climbing onto the couch between them. "What are you talking about?" Ellie wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We were just talking about how lucky we are to have you." Lily giggled, snuggling into Ellie's side. "I'm the lucky one." Richard reached over, ruffling Lily's hair. "I think we're all pretty lucky." The three of them sat together, the fire crackling softly, the weight of the past giving way to the promise of the future. For Ellie, it was a moment of clarity, a realization that the life she had always dreamed of was no longer out of reach. It was here, in this house with these people, and it was hers to embrace. As the snow continued to fall gently outside, blanketing the world in quiet peace, Ellie felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. She had found her place, her family, her home, and as Richard's hand rested lightly over hers, she knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next, bound by the love and hope that had brought them together. For the first time, Ellie truly believed in the magic of Christmas and in the endless possibilities of a new beginning.